You're listening to the Blue Angel Phantoms podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Notoff, and I interview former Blue Angel pilots and crew. However, this episode is going to be slightly different. Instead of doing a career retrospective, today we're going to focus on the Blue Angels transition all the way back in 1974, away from the F4 Phantom and to the A4 Skyhawk. Now, to do this, I'm going to enlist some old interview footage with Jerry Turkey Tucker, who was the opposing solo for that last year in 1973 with the F4 Phantoms, and then later transitioned to the lead solo role for the first year with the A4 Skyhawk in 1974. Now, if you've been following the team in the current day, you're probably aware that the Blue Angels are transitioning to the F-18 Super Hornet. This will be the first time the Blue Angels are flying a new aircraft since 1987, and it's a much celebrated transition. That was not the case back in 1973 when the Blue Angels made the decision to transition to the A4 Skyhawk. Now, 1973 was a terrible year for the Blue Angels. They actually lost 6 different aircraft in a variety of different accidents, including at Lakehurst, New Jersey in July of that year, where the team lost 2 of those F4 Phantoms and 3 team members, including boss Skip Umstead. Now, this is definitely a difficult topic to discuss, but Jerry does it in such an authentic and sensitive way that I am going to share it here on this podcast. So Jerry's going to discuss those terrible events of 1973, and then he's going to share the team's transition process as they sourced a new aircraft and how they decided on the A4 Skyhawk as their platform of choice for 1974. He's then going to discuss the key differences between the F4 Phantom and the A4 Skyhawk and some of the more positive changes that came out of the team's transition to the A4 Skyhawk, including the team being reorganized as a naval squadron. Now, to kick off the discussion, as mentioned, Jerry is going to recall the terrible events that took place at Lakehurst, New Jersey in 1973.
We were going to Lakehurst from Pensacola. We stopped in Oceana for fuel. And Mike Murphy, who was the slot pilot, Captain Mike Murphy, our Marine Corps, one of the Marine Corps, we still had 2. John Fogg was on the left wing, and Mike was on the slot. His airplane had a hydraulic failure, a utility hydraulic failure, so they left the Albert, Fat Albert, and the maintenance guys with air. He took my airplane, and he took it up and left me there with his airplane to be fixed, and they just replaced the pump right there. Our maintenance was phenomenal, and they checked it, and I was getting ready to go. Now, also, I think it was Marlon Weida was flying in Steve's back seat, Steve Lambert's back seat at that time, because we were down an airplane because of Lake Charles, so we were only having 5 anyway. So they left me behind. They went off to Lakehurst to do the arrival and get checkpoints and do arrival maneuvers, and I was supposed to just come up and I'd orbit a couple of times and get my checkpoints. And when I got there, because I didn't need any more than that. Well, I just got to the end of the runway, and the tower called and said, your narrator just called, and they want you to come back and take a phone call. Well, that's unusual. What about Albert? I'd like Albert to go head on up to Lakehurst. I said, there's been an accident, he told me that over the air. So, okay. So I went back, went in and took the call from Smoke, and he told me what had happened. They were doing a little V roll, and Skip rolled too low. The top was low, and when he was coming out of it, Mike Murphy was on the right wing now because it was little V. It was, meaning instead of being slot, he was on the right wing. Foggy was on the left wing, John Fogg. Steve was doing single solo, just getting the solo checkpoints with Marlon Weida, who was normally number 2 in the back seat. He was clipping the treetops at when he bottomed the thing out. The tendency in formation is to not get wider when things get dicey, but to get closer, because we trusted each other implicitly, and if he'll make it, he makes it, you're going to make it. It's just that simple. So they were just kind of tipping treetops. Well, Murph got really, really close. Foggy had seen this before because he was in the trail loop accident, and he bailed out of the maneuver. He just pulled off and pulled out before they even got to the bottom. He knew something was screwed up. Murph stayed right there, and then he got a little PIO, and he came up and hit Skip, hit the UHT. The UHT is the tail, the thing that in the back, the elevator in the Phantom, the whole thing moved. It was kind of had anhedral, where it went down. Well, it stuck into Murph, and it broke the right side off. Well, that immediately flipped Skip over on his back. Murph went straight ahead for 2.5 miles, with Ron Thomas in his backseater. Went straight ahead and never ejected. He just hit it, went into the ground on a ridge line 2 miles away. Ron attempted ejection when he saw they were going to crash. So he tried. He didn't make it. He didn't. He waited too long. Skip, being an old solo pilot, he got flipped upside down, and as soon as he did, he started pushing to get away from the ground. When he did, because of the UH-10, it started to roll. He initiated ejection as soon as it started to roll. Well, it rolled so fast that Jerry Harvey, the backseater, he was in dual mode, normal mode, not airshow mode. He came out, his chute came out, streamed, caught a tree. The tree broke and bent and broke as he hit the ground. Not a scratch. No chute. 400 knot ejection, not a scratch. Skip's ejection, he started up the rails, only got about that far and just killed him. Foggy came in and landed when Steve landed, and then they called me. So I just stayed. They told me to just stay there, not even go to Lakehurst. We had 2 leader applicants for the following year were at Oceana, and they were at the tower. They came and saw us off and stayed around for some reason. I'm not exactly sure why they changed, but when I saw that, the guy saw the applicant saw that I was a little upset, and he took me home with him. He said they just wanted me to stay there, and they'd know tomorrow. They'd get their ducks in a row and come back through tomorrow, and we'd know what to do. So he took me home, and I stayed with them that night, and then went back to Pensacola the next day. After that, we were just reeling with what to do next, because we lost Skip, we lost Murph, we lost Ron Thomas. The future of the team was right on edge. We weren't sure if it was going to be around anymore. So they took us back. They sent Luch Adam. Luch Adam was a former solo pilot, former CO. They sent him down as adult leadership, just to kind of keep things under control. I don't know if he'd been a CAG or so yet, but just a really neat guy. He came down. Whitey Feitner came down. Whitey's an old ex. There was 2 or 3 others. Admiral Ferris, Jim Ferris, was our boss at Chief of Naval Air Training, and he was a Rear Admiral, Jim Ferris. And they were the ones making the decisions. The CNO at the time was Admiral Zumwalt. And he knew the team's importance. He knew, as a recruiting tool, if nothing else, as a recruiting tool, it was just way too important. And he's a black shoe. He was a boat driver. He wasn't even an aviator. So there was a lot of calls to disband. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. He said it is worth it. It's important that we keep that for the Navy. I mean, how else are we going to get something that's impressive to the people in Iowa and in the Midwest and the people that can't see ships? Can't see naval aviation. This brings that to them. It brings them to the Navy. We have to do that. But we don't have to stay in the Phantom. So they decided to change airplanes, make it a squadron. They had the accident report came about. Once we decided what we're going to do, I flew the A7, drove over to Cecil, showed up on Friday, and I had 15 hours under my belt by Tuesday afternoon. And came back with my recommendations in the A7. Steve Lambert went and flew the A4. Some Weasel, Marlon Weeda went up. I think he flew the T2, I think. They were even looking at that. They talked about the F-14, but there was no way. That was too expensive, and it was too new. I mean, they just had the RAG out here. They didn't even have any fleet squadron ships, so that wasn't going to happen. And then they made the decision that it was going to be the A4, which was the best choice. The A7 had too many hiccupy things, underpowered, and if you lost a stab under G, it could go right in the ground. It was an odd airplane for that environment only. It's a great airplane. That environment, we'd have had to change way too many things, and it really wouldn't have been able to demonstrate the airplane properly. A4 was an aging airplane, excess of them around. It was toward the end of the war, so A7s were replacing them so we could get them, and they were cheap. And so I think that, and it was going to be a much simpler airplane to fly. Maintenance got cut in half, went from 150 people to 80 people on the whole enlisted cadre, I believe was the number, or 80 to 40, but they cut it in half. Really easy to maintain. And the last flight of the Phantom was John Fogg, Marlon Weeda, and myself. And since I was a leader, being a lead solo, I took him to Cherry Point. We flew up and turned them over to the Marines at Cherry Point. On the way, we got vectored. We didn't have radar. Got vectored into a thunderstorm. Got struck by lightning on the last flight. The lightning hit my airplane, went out both wingtips, burnt my nose and burnt Marlon's nose, and Foggy had a mark on the airplane where the lightning hit me and then went out to them. Just couldn't leave us alone. Making a point, I guess. But we got there okay, landed, and they took the airplane, and I don't even know what happened to them after that. I think one of them wound up at the Pax River and some other things. It was really, then of course, we had to fly in all over, all the funerals and stuff we had to go to, flew all over the country. Mike Murphy's dad is an Army general, Air Force general from World War II. He was one of the ones that made general in about 2 years, or made colonel in 2 years. And then when the war was over, they kicked a bunch of them back, but he was a very, very capable man, so they kept him and made him. He stayed a colonel for 20 years, and then they made him a general. But he was a really good officer, really good for the Air Force. Skip was from. He's buried in Pensacola at Brancas, but met a bunch of his family. Really, really neat people. Hard time.
Up next, I asked Jerry to share some insight into the actual structural changes that took place with the Blue Angels after they transitioned from the F4 Phantom to the A4 Skyhawk, and this is what he had to say.
The first season was pretty traumatic with my best friend, 3 of my best friends killed. Two, and Ron, I was pretty close to Ron too. Ron Thomas was enlisted, but Murph and Skip especially was really a special guy. It was hard. It was very difficult. And then and Ron Thomas, AME, he was a cool guy. He was really a lot of fun. Good crew chief. Really, really good sailor. Really was. And then to go to all of the funerals, go through those, the services and the burial, and that was very hard. And then the reorganization of the team, the transition to airplanes. We did reorganize it, became a squadron. It no longer was a team, it became the Blue Angel Squadron now. Getting a new CO in that now is a commanding officer, and not an officer in charge. Not exactly a Navy squadron because it doesn't have an executive officer. We brought in an admin officer to help. All part of the things from the accident report, the fact that there was just too much going on. There was just too much, and it just was overwhelming. Accumulative fatigue is what they attributed it all for. It was part of our error, obviously, but accumulated fatigue. So getting that organized, then getting the air show, redoing the air show because it's a new airplane, new maneuvers, how are we going to do the old maneuvers in this airplane, what the speeds are. The Phantom, everything was at 500 knots, and one maneuver is 550 knots. This one is not. This was 400 knots was the best roll rate, and 450 for one maneuver. But you had to find that. And none of us had flown that airplane. I mean, the A4 was a new airplane for all of us. I don't think any of us had any A4 time. And then we came up with a couple maneuvers that were new, that really showcased the Skyhawk, the A4 Skyhawk. Then going through the training as lead solo, I don't know, maybe I overstepped my bounds, but I really accepted and felt responsibility to make sure nobody died. I just wasn't going to let it happen again. Tony Less, he is such a prince. He was our first leader in the A4 and the first commanding officer of the Blues. I probably didn't handle it after the accident. That's right. Before, Skip was an officer in charge. They commissioned it as a squadron, and Tony Less, Admiral Less, was a commander, a Bobby Sox skipper, which means he was skipper of a squadron as a lieutenant commander. There were 3 of them. Casey Jones was another one, and there were a couple of others. But those were the two of the Bobby Soxers wound up being leaders of the Blues, because of timing, because they were up for a bonus command and they were still too junior to do some of the other things. Tony Less, who was a commander at the time, came in as the leader, a commanding officer and leader of the Blue Angels. He had a really good leadership style. He was a very calm, fun-loving guy, young at heart, still is young at heart, and he put up with my BS. I mean, because I probably took a lot more internal and on making sure that everything was done right, and I safely. After going through the war, losing guys there, and then losing those 3 guys and 6 airplanes in 1 year, I was a little gun shy, and I wasn't going to let it happen again because I didn't have enough say before. Now I was in a position of leadership, and I was going to make sure it didn't happen. So I listened. I really did. I listened to my opposing solo. Vance Parker came in as my opposing solo. Well, probably one of the best. He and my opposing solo in 79 were the best naval aviators I've ever flown with. Bar none. I mean, and I flew with some really, really good ones. They're phenomenal aviators. And both of them understood where I came from, and they knew I had nothing but their best interest at heart, and they let me do it. I wrote an SOP, a standard operating procedure that set altitudes for maneuvers, and so that we could, in fact, document what we were doing and how to do it every year, and define terms. We defined a term, a yug. A yug is what we called, before you did a maneuver, you pop the stick. That's all it is a yug. It's just a pop. Sometimes it just gets the nose started up. Airplane doesn't move up. It just gets the nose in that attitude, and then you do whatever you do, and you're going the right direction now. That would never been defined, so we defined it. How to do the rolls. Who was responsible for what? What set-on was, and what crowd. What is crowd? How close you are to each other as a crowd. Set-on. When you do maneuvers as a solo, that's set-on, up. How much up you go depends on how high you are and how far out you are. Air shows designed at 1,000 feet to the 1,500 feet to the center line. We had to get all those things on writing, and we trained to them. And we wouldn't not train to them. We wouldn't do maneuvers that were outside of them. And I just got too tense at times. But Tony would take me aside and pat me on the back, and he was able to calm me down 99 and 9/10% of the time, and never jumped in my shit. I mean, he could have. A lot of leaders would have, but he had a different way about it, and I thank him to this day for that. His patience. It was really cool. And because of that, we got through a really good season. Our first season, we had no accidents, no incidents. We had good air shows. And we had a lot of fun.
Up next, Jerry tells us about some of the key differences between flying the F4 Phantom and the A4 Skyhawk in a Blue Angels demo, and some of the key modifications the team had to make to the airplane, mainly the fuel cell, so that it could fly inverted during flight. He also shares a couple close calls he had during his time flying the A4 Skyhawk.
The airplane was a phenomenal airplane, and it really is probably the best air show airplane they've had. That's going to rub some Phantom guys the wrong way, but this airplane with the big engine in it, P420 I think it was, it had 720 degree per second roll rate, whereas the Phantom was 420 degrees per second, so it rolled a lot faster. Better than 1-to-1 thrust to weight ratio in the airplane without the afterburner. When you're light, you had to be down about 1,000 pounds, but that P420 engine was a phenomenal engine. The airplane had slats, which were gravity controlled. They just fell down. When you get below a certain airspeed, they would go down, and it would give you a lower stall speed of about 2 to 3 knots is all. But in our environment, we could get one out at a time, and you didn't want that. And we could lock them out by accident. By G, you get the thing out by G, and then you're going too fast for it to come up. It was over center, and it wouldn't come up. So we bolted them up. We only lost, like I said, 3 knots of stall speed higher than the other, which was not really a factor. The airplane was so controllable. It had an inverted fuel tank. It was about this big, probably. It had flapper valves all over it. And when you rolled inverted, the flapper valves were supposed to shut and trap a minute of fuel at normal power settings so that you had fuel. Oil was not a problem in the newer jets. Flying inverted, oil's not a problem anymore, like it is in some props and some other airplanes. But fuel is. You have to have gas when you're upside down. And that was a okay plan, except when we were in winter training, they were modifying our airplanes, and I was out in a T with Vance Parker, who became the solo pilot. With me. He was my opposing solo for the 74 season. And we were practicing inverted. I was practicing inverted, rolled upside down. 10, 15 seconds into inverted, the engine quit. And I was only about 100 feet. So now that's the loudest quiet you will ever hear, is an engine that stops when you're that low to the ground. So it's all reactive, pushed out, got it right side up, came around the horn, hit the button, relit it, and it relit. But by the time I came out, it was a southerly run, so I'm aimed right at the field. So I went right on back in and landed. And what had happened was the two of the flapper valves, the springs that pop them shut, had broken, and it stuck them open. So when it went upside down, they stayed open, and all the gas ran out. So it was fuel starvation. As soon as I got it right side up, and the fuel filled it up again, and so it started running when I relit the engine. So we knew we had to change the fuel cells. So we went to McDonnell Douglas, told them the problem we had. We needed a new type of fuel system in the airplane for inverted flight, to give us inverted flight of at least a minute at full power. If they're going to redo it, we want at least that. So they came up with a plan that had the main tank, which was probably about this tall, maybe, and about that big, and that big. It sat behind the pilot. And it had a standpipe in it that came up, and baffles to kind of keep it from flopping around. And the standpipe came to the top and had a little kind of blunderbuss look at the top of the thing. Well, they wouldn't let me just do the flight test, so they brought TPS out, test pilot school pilots out to Edwards Air Force Base. They modified an airplane at Long Beach, flew it to Edwards. They came out, and I came over from winter training to be with them, just as another pilot, and I flew chase on it while they went on their range and did the inverted. And the guy got it out there, and he rolled it upside down, and the engine quit. And he got it right side up and got it relit, and we came back in and landed right away, and asked the engineers to meet us in the conference room there at Palmdale, which is where we were staging out of. And he came in, he had his bow tie and his pocket protector and his slide rule, and came in and sat down. It was the guy that designed the original fuel system for the A4. I mean, it's from 1952 timeframe, 54 when that airplane came out, when it was designed. And he rolled the thing out, and I was standing there and looked, and I said, well, Lord, that's why it quit. And he said, what do you mean? He says, well, the bellows comes, there's nothing above it. I mean, we go to 0G when we roll inverted, and if you do that 0G, you're going to take a big gulp of air, because there's nothing to keep above that thing that collects the gas down there. You roll upside down, it's just air before the fuel can get in the holes at the bottom to fill it in. I said, well, I wasn't asked to get you inverted. I was just asked to let you fly inverted. Oh, well, thank you. We need to go back to the drawing boards on this. I have to get inverted too. So, okay. And I mean, we didn't raise our voice till he left the room. The TPS guys just kind of giggled about it. And they went back, and they came out with one that had a pressure tank in it that gave us, I think it's 10 minutes of fuel at full power, but it was pressurized, and it was fed all the time from the fuel system. And that one was phenomenal. I remember we took off from Pensacola and flew from Pensacola all the way to Mobile inverted in the back row. Just as soon as we got going toward Mobile, which is 50 miles or so, and never had a hiccup, not a hiccup with the fuel. So that issue was gone. Another problem they had was the pull. The A4 was very, very light nosed, even full nose down. And the A4, when you trim it, you trim the stab down. And then you're repositioning it. When you pull, then you got the elevator on the back of it. It's not a supersonic airplane, so that it can do that. And so we would trim it up one spot, and then you can't trim full nose down, because then you don't have enough authority. Because trim full nose down, the tail's like this, and this thing comes up. Well, you don't have enough control authority to do anything. So they had to come up with a new system. And they were extremely reluctant. And as it turns out, we got the engineer that designed it, and it had a bunch of bob weights and stuff is the way they had the trim. And he said, we really don't want to touch it, because we had a heck of a time getting this thing to work in the first place. And we hit on this by accident. I mean, this bob weight thing was a fluke. It's just something that happened one day by mistake, and we didn't realize till the guy said, hey, it's perfect. I said, what? They looked and saw it was really goofy, But they left it that way and it worked fine forever. Well, they had to come up with something. So we figured out, we set the trim at 1 degree nose up. 1 degree nose up, I think. And then they did put a spring system in past that would pull it against the deck. But you did trim it. You didn't do anything with trim. You trimmed it to 1 degree nose up and left it alone. Or 1 degree nose down, one of the two, I can't remember. It had some other things that were a little unusual. It had, you could disconnect the airplane and it would disconnect all the hydraulics from the roll and the pitch. And they swore to us that you could never only disconnect one. Well, I took off on a dirty roll and started to roll. It was like it was set in concrete because it had disconnected only the roll and not the pitch. So it could be, Murphy's Law. If it can happen, it will. We did both the slats. Low transition was fun in the airplane. It was so controllable. The dirty roll was a little different. In the Phantom, you had to pull the Phantom, the F4 Phantom, a dirty roll. You had to pull the nose up, and then you had to wait a little bit before you started the roll because the airplane kind of fell out of the sky when you did it. It lost lift and it fell down. The A4 rolled so fast, you could sit there and roll and climb. I mean, it didn't do anything. So to do the dirty roll, you had to pull the power back a little bit, and then when you got inverted, you had to pull it back toward the ground to make it look a little scary. And it was unbelievably controllable. The only problem I had is I overdid it one day and on the top, and when I came out, I was really two-nosed, and I knew I was going to hit the ground. So I just did everything I could, started trimming a little bit and pulled back as hard as I could, and I was really lucky. I was at El Toro, and it was there was a cross taxiway where you left the runway. It was a very wide, very short runway. It was like a 25 or 50 foot long, and I touched down right in the middle of that and bounced back in the air. So it was just like a touch and go.
Did it damage the plane?
No, it was like a touch and go. It was just like a touch. You go out and do touch and goes all the time, landing practice. If it had missed, I'd have been out in the dirt, and that probably wouldn't have been too cool. But it wasn't. I tell everybody I planned it that way, but I think everybody knows different. And it was I just overdid it. I just drove it a little too hard, and to make it look scary. Other side of it, Harry Gann, who's a photographer that took a lot of pictures of the Blues, and Jim Preston, our photographer, were standing right there. And I might have been grandstanding a little bit too for them. But Jim grabbed Harry and pulled him out of the way so I didn't land on him. That show, my dad and mom were there, sitting with the commanding general of El Toro in the VIP section. And the general looked at Dad and said, "Did he hit the ground?" And Dad says, "I think he did." But I'm not the only one. I guess Steve Shoemaker did the same thing in the Phantom and asked the boss, and the boss said, and I did the same thing. "Boss, I think I hit the ground." I said, "You okay?" He said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Let's go. Join up. Let's go." Steve was a little cooler. Says, "Boss, it was interesting. I think I touched down on that dirty roll." He says, "Were you hurt?" I said, "No, sir, but I was really scared." So, "You okay?" "Yes, sir. Let's go." So we did. Both of us we kept on with the show, and it didn't hurt a thing. Didn't hurt a thing. I mean, it was a normal touchdown. I mean, the airplane's stressed. The A4 is stressed, and the Phantom as well, to be dropped from about 20 feet with nothing. It just dropped, and this was a controlled landing, basically. I can't think of much else. It had only, we didn't have the water. They called it water. The fuel metered fuel system for smoke in the A4. We just had smoke. We had an oil tank. It's like I said, 10 weight, real lightweight oil. And they had a little trouble getting that to work because the engine temperature was a broader range. So they had to really work with it to get it to where it had smoke at a lot more power settings. Not much else. They had the wings were very, very sensitive, but it was wonderful for the rolls, vertical rolls. I mean, if you hit the corner, you hit it perfectly. I mean, 720 degrees a second. And we only do 6 rolls. You were done in a second and a half or so. I mean, or 2 seconds. Usually it's 4 or 5 seconds. So but your head's, you got to cage your head because you're spinning so fast. And it came out that you had to wait until you were empty in the wings with fuel before you did those rolls. Because if you hit the corner with fuel in the wing, they would hydraulic out and it would bust stringers. Vance Parker did it a couple times. They had to replace 1 or 2 wings just because he did it perfectly. I mean, it's pretty bad when you break the airplane by doing something perfectly, but that's what would happen. Other than that, it was smaller. I mean, you couldn't reach things. Some guys of your size couldn't reach down to the radios. You had to reach across. It was right up against my shoulders. Big guys in it was fun to watch. Josh Yancey get out. It was a hoot to watch him get in and out because he was so big. The whole thing was only about this wide. You really were apart. You really felt apart.
All right. Special thanks to Jerry Turkey Tucker for being a part of this podcast and allowing us to share an excerpt from a conversation we now had over 3 years ago. I know we touched on some very difficult topics, but Jerry was incredibly candid, and I appreciate him allowing us to publish this. Now, if you want to learn more about Jerry's career, you can do so by going on the Fighter Pilot podcast, where Jerry has an episode where he discusses his time flying the F-8 Crusader. You can also see a documentary that I created about Jerry Tucker's time on the Blue Angels on the Blue Angel Phantoms YouTube channel. So until next time, thank you so much for the support, and I look forward to talking to you real soon.